Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel. And my guest today is Renna Shesso, who has written a really fun book, which is called Planets for Pagans, Sacred Sites, Ancient Law, and Magical Stargazing. And so here you are, Renna. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be with you today.
I thought it would be good to explore a little bit of the lore around um, constellations and the planets, etc. And I thought we don't ever really talk about the North Star as astrologers.
No,
Um,
it's not.
and yet, it's the very start of your book is with the North Star. Tell us why, and tell us about the importance of the North Star, the relevance of the North Star.
Ah, well, I probably started the book with the North Star because that's my memory of how I started stargazing as a little kid. Um, my extended family would camp um, up in the Indiana Dunes area, which is along the banks of the shore of Lake Michigan. Wooded, blueberries, really lovely. Um, and the stargazing at that point, this would have been early 50s, not much light pollution anywhere at that point, really, unless you were in downtown Chicago. Um, so the stargazing was just magnificent. My grandma was an astrologer. Her son grew up to work for NASA. So just um, the idea that science can't get along with the older arts is interesting. But I remember learning to find the North Star. And living in the Northern Hemisphere, that was one that you could almost always find because you could spot the Big Dipper, that asterism of Ursa Major. And that one has just been so consistent to Northern Hemisphere lore. It shows up all over the place. It was important to the Egyptians. It was used in navigation. It just appears kind of everywhere, whether or not it's seen as a bear pointing it out. But different cultures found different pointers to it. But the idea that everything was pivoting around one point made it a point of eternity, which is like, whoa, that's pretty big. So that tends to be a real mooring for me. And it seemed like a great place to start the book because I needed some kind of anchor. There's just an awful lot out there.
Just for those listening in the British Isles, when you talk about the Big Dipper or the Little Dipper, that is the plow for everyone else. So just so that everyone understands what we're talking about. Um,
And
and
what is it instead?
the plow,
Oh, the plow, of course. Yeah,
yes.
great
So
chariot, plow.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's clear that the North Star has attracted attention for a very long time. What are some of the stories around it?
Ah, well, some of them going back much further to a different pivot point at the time of the high points of the Egyptian pharaohs. The northernmost star, the closest one to our Polaris now, was Thuban, which is part of Ursa Minor. But that was the point that everything was rotating around, but just gradual progression of the equinoxes and precession of the equinoxes. We shift slightly, but at that point for them, that was where the spirit of the pharaoh went to reside for the rest of eternity. After this journey underground that would bring them up the Milky Way and up to their North Star, their pivot point. And I find that absolutely fascinating because that idea of that journey underground, um, a number of different planets have that sensibility for us. Um, just, when we're watching the waning moon and it disappears around dawn as it goes into its conjunction with the sun where it's not visible anymore, it seems to go underground and reappear in the west a few days later when it's a new moon again. And Mercury and Venus do similar things like that, where they're showing up on one side or showing up in the other. But that idea of a journey underground where it's reborn in a new way, to me, that's compelling. And I think that kind of motion fed into how we perceive the planets in terms of astrological meanings. Because, of course, in early work, astrology and astronomy were not two completely different sciences where people didn't speak to each other. It was all coming from one main point. So that one to me is crucial. There's other stories, maybe not prominent in my head at the moment. Let me just flip through this useful book.
Well, while you're having a little think about that, I'm just reflecting on what you said about the that journey, that happens. And of course, the sun disappears every night. And so in ancient Egypt, there was that story about, the sun going under. In fact, he was born each day out of, Newt birthed him every morning. So he was born anew every morning. And I think that everything in nature speaks of renewal, whether it's the seasons or whether it's the motion of the planets or the sun as well, and the moon, as you say. There is that really important thing about rebirth, and I feel that there is a great deal of misunderstanding about the underworld as being associated always with evil, because it's not intended to be that way. It's meant to be the journey that we take in death and then come back again. So I think that it's very important for us to remember that. And even the way the chart is set up, we have the horizon, and we have what's below the horizon, which can't be seen, and we have what's above the horizon, and everything is moving constantly to rise and set again. Yeah. So this is deeply, deeply embedded in our mythology, because it is a fundamental experience of being on our planet.
Yes, absolutely. And I know when I'm doing ceremonial work, when I'm facing the east, part of what I'm talking about is place of beginnings, place of renewal. When I'm facing the west, that's a place of farewell. And for people in my community, I'm looking to the west, and we're bidding farewell there as they continue their journey across the river, however we phrase that. But the west is that place of things recede, things become not visible in our realm for a while. And just the motion of the planets, the motion of the sun each day, everything that we're watching contributes to that, which is just fascinating.
And it's fundamental too, because the very, let's call it the architecture of the birth chart, of the astrology chart, the very fact that we look at the ascendant as being, or we look at the east as being favorable versus the west, which is unfavorable in traditional astrology. The reason being, the sun is rising and it's coming into his strength and peaks at noon, which is represented by the midheaven, where he's, very strong. And then it's the setting from the 8th house, that house linked with death, because what is it that's dying? It's the sun. The sun is going down. It's waning in its power. And then, of course, it disappears under the horizon. So it's 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 so fundamental what you just said to absolutely everything in astrology.
Yeah, and so much of this, I mean, humans have been looking at this for thousands of years. The constellations that we see now have shifted slightly, but they're basically the same things that the Babylonians, the Sumerians were looking at, and often portrayed by the same figures. So these gradual shifts, I know when people talk about these big pictures, that eventually it's all going to look different. Not in my lifetime, not in yours. If our architecture of constellations remains consistent over thousands of years, there's some real, to me, gut level, heart level stuff in there that we've been looking at for ages, and each culture tends to interpret it differently. I mean, Eskimos aren't going to look at the night sky. Inuit people aren't going to look at that and see kangaroos. It just, you relate it to what you see around you, but it's so incredibly consistent. And the fact that the constellations were consistent is what allowed them to pay attention to the planets, because they were moving around. Just the idea of what we can focus on, what we can see. The book sticks strictly with visual stargazing, unassisted. I've just gone to too many night stargazing events where everyone stands in a line waiting for their turn at the telescope to see the rings of Saturn. And that's delightful. But in the meantime, no one's looking at, and look at the arc of these planets. We can see this one and this one and this one, and there's a constellation, and there's all this stuff in plain sight. And we forget that our eyes can do a lot of this and have done for thousands of years.
Yes, our ancient ancestors who collated and imagined the myths and the lore that we're talking about certainly did not have telescopes. And one of the things that I really like about your book is that you give us instructions on how to find things as well. And I think that that's just beautiful, because we are not taught. Most of us can spot the plow, the Big Dipper, the Little Dipper, but that might be about all.
The other one that people seem to be able to pick out pretty readily is Orion, or at least his belt. And some of this is just, I was in scouting as a kid too, and that was one where we were camping, and sometimes in areas that were much more open and greater visibility and had markers to spot the North Star and things like that. So there was encouragement there, but also just looking up and looking at things in the night sky just seemed really natural at that point, because we didn't have that level of light pollution. And when I speak to people now about the stars, they go, well, you can't see them in the city. Well, once you decide you can't see them in the city, you stop looking. And then, of course, you don't see them in the city. I live in Metro Denver, and a lot of the stargazing in this book was done off the back porch. And I'm 2 blocks off one of the busiest streets in the city. And this, granted, was about 10 years ago, and it's really gotten worse even in that amount of time. But the point is, I can still see stars most nights. I remember my sister lives in England, and we had just come out of, it might have been the National Portrait Gallery, but it was twilight. And I was trying to get my bearings, because, I mean, it's downtown London. What would I possibly see? Well, what I saw was a tiny crescent moon next to Venus. And if you're not looking, you don't see them, but they were in pretty plain sight. So it just, these are accessible, but we forget to look for them. And one of the nice things I've had in feedback on this book is people saying, I remember seeing the Milky Way as a child. I've got to find a place to show that to my own kids. And that's one that not usually visible in a city. But just the fact that it would have that reaction from people because they remember being someplace, or it was dark enough where they were as kids, that they could see the Milky Way. So it just this amazing highway of stars that actually is seen as that in many cultures, where it's seen as some kind of mystic stream that carried you up toward the North Star. Um, it, it's fun. There's so much here to explore.
You're right that people are under the impression that you can't see stars in cities, but you can. You just don't see them as as clearly. But yes, you can. And I love looking out and seeing whatever planets are around at any given time, in addition to the moon, etc. And I'm always encouraging my students to do so.
Mm, good. I'm glad.
Well, they're forever getting little messages going, look west, you'll see this, look north, you'll see that. Um, and they love it because it's that connection. Astrology on paper is wonderful. But when we look at the sky and we can see what we see on paper, then it takes on a new level because you're engaging with that natural, the very thing that you are studying or working with is alive because you can actually see this. So we can see the sun setting in the west whilst the moon is rising in the east on a full moon. We can see what it looks like to have a moon Jupiter conjunction, which happened just recently.
Mm,
We can see all of these things, and when I see that, it just fills my heart with joy because I'm actually connecting directly rather than through a chart, which is a depiction rather than the real thing. And the beauty of it is that if you look at the horizon and you're looking at, you can actually see the planets rising or the planets setting, depending, of course, on the time of day. But it's a wonderful thing because then you understand why you're looking what's happening in the east and the west and in the chart. Talk us through the importance of the directions because you were talking about, and there was a slight fraction of a second there that I lost you when you were talking about the West, but you were talking about the West being about farewell, and you were talking about the East being beginnings, of course, because of dawn, and it makes sense. But what about North and South? What what are the meanings attributed to them?
well, in the system that I use, and this is not universal, um, east is perceived as connected with the element of air, south with fire, west with water, north with earth. Um, the setting and rising of planets, rising in the east, setting in the west, brings that association into each of those directions as well. Um, North and South, to me, don't have quite that level of connection. The North has the North Star and that firmament, that circumpolar arrangement of non-setting constellations. So really solid there, which fits with the element of Earth. Um, I'm always a little baffled mystically by how to symbolize fire, how to work with that symbolically, which I'm still working on. It helped when people started tracking Chiron and I could realize that I had a grand trine in fire. But only if you count Chiron. So it was like, oh, I should be able to understand more about fire and its symbolism. Where just different cultures associate this differently, but the East being birth and childhood, youngest childhood, South being more like the combustible teenage years, West being that mellowing into parenthood age in the north being the elder years, and associating them then also with some spring in the east, summer in the south, fall, autumn in the west, winter for the north. So just different associations. But like I said, these kind of vary by practices, cultures.
But there does
I'm
seem,
normal witchy.
but there does seem to be a logic, I think, in the connection between the South and fire, because obviously this is the hottest part of the day, the warmest part of the day. It's the sun at its peak, and of course from that we derive the meaning for the midheaven being, about being the part of the chart where we are very visible in public.
Mm-hmm.
And so then if we look at the IC, which would be the north, that makes complete sense that it would be the opposite, where we are invisible, where we are um, most private. And,
Mm-hmm.
and I think if you're talking, it's odd, isn't it? Because at the same time, we think about what you said with the North Star and the link with eternity, but also, the place where the soul goes when, when it, and it now makes complete sense too, because here we have the IC at the bottom of the chart, and I have come across interpretations of the IC which are about old age and death, because that fourth house can represent death as well. So it's when we start teasing out the lore around these things that we begin to make sense of it all. When do we see the North Star? Oh yeah, at night. It's not at midday.
Right.
It's at night. And so consequently, we do see the sun most clearly in the south around midday, especially in the summertime. But then the North Star can only be seen at night. So of course we're going to think of it as being something nocturnal and colder.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, Part of what I find interesting with the plow, the Big Dipper, that portion of Ursa Major, it's 7 stars. And 7 is such an important number for us anyway, because of the visible planets, if we're including sun and moon as planets for this purpose. But the chariot card in the tarot is 7th major arcana card, 7 stars, it's 7, it's a chariot, and the Great Chariot is another name for the plow or the Big Dipper. And it's like, well, okay, maybe it's a coincidence, but just thinking about that as a journey of life, what is your consistent point? Because that idea of it being a pivot point, Polaris, the pole, is kind of based on the idea of a picket for a horse, or one of those dog leash things people put in their backyard where they put a stake down and the animal can just move around that at the length of their rope. They can rotate, but they can't get farther out than that, where there's this repetition, circling motion. And you see that much more if you're out at night facing the north. You see that movement. It's almost obviously visible. Within 5 minutes, it changes quite a bit because you're looking at that tiny portion of it. The night sky, if you're facing south, you'll see everything shifting across the sky over time, but it's like a bigger clock face. So the movement's not as obvious. That's interesting. I know when I've taught just very rudimentary stuff about astrology, because that is not my main focus. I've got the basics. But just to give people a sense of what we're even talking about, planets, chart, whatever, I've simply called the chart being a basic map of a portion of the sky at the moment that you're born. And the idea that it's a map of the sky on their birthday seems to finally register with people that it's not just a bunch of gibberish on a page, because just someone who doesn't know that at all and doesn't recognize the glyphs, you know, might as well be cuneiform. So just, but saying it's a map, but still, no matter how good your map, the map isn't the same as being on the land. So just what you were saying earlier about the idea that, you know, your students can go out and look for things actually happening, because that's to me one of the really sad disconnects. I get it that astronomers may not be worried about their charts and just can't even talk about such woo-woo material, but I think it is sad if people are on the astrology side but can't find anything in the night sky except maybe the moon.
Yeah, I
Pretty straightforward. A lot of them are very visible.
yeah, they are. Um, I was listening to you and a thought came to me, but it's actually gone. So I'm just going to ask you what else, the other thing that was on my mind, which is Venus.
Mm.
So Venus in Western astrology is pretty consistent. You know, it doesn't matter whether she's the morning star, the evening star, the meaning is now pretty much the same. Venus is Venus. But that wasn't always so, was it?
No, it wasn't. And I know some of the story about this, but I don't know that I'll ever understand the reasoning. Um, this was a case with various cultures, including the Maya, where if it was an evening star, it was a happy thing. If it was a morning star, we're going to war, or something to that effect. And I may have them reversed, but it just, they meant completely different things. And I, that's one I can't get my head around. And I don't know if in any of the existing texts that go with some of these cultures, they thought to explain this is our reasoning behind that. They wouldn't have needed to in their own culture. So I don't know that that's one that we'll ever totally get a picture on, but it's definitely different.
Did they, I'm trying to remember because I came across this with the Maya fairly recently, but did they see it as being two different planets, or did they realize that it was the same planet? Because they called it different things according to whether it was the morning or the evening star.
My understanding is they understood very clearly it was the same planet.
Mm.
And that's from, shoot, what's his name? We've got a gigantic bibliography, names vanish. Anthony Aveni, Aveni, who's written extensively about Central and South American planetary lore.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent resource. It just, yeah, I believe it's his understanding, grasp that they definitely knew it was the same planet, but they saw it in a different mood. You know, it had different properties at that point.
In some respects, I can understand that it could have different meanings because, and I'm just trying to understand why, and wondering whether the idea is linked with proximity to the sun, but then again, that could happen. No, that idea is gone. That idea is not going to work. But yes,
but it has to be gone because Venus is never going to be that far from the sun.
Exactly. So anyway, I think it is interesting that they would have seen Venus in two different ways. And maybe, you know, if we think about the Greek mythology around Venus, she's not always the most pleasant
Mm.
goddess.
Hmm.
She can really cause problems, and either because she's jealous or because she's manipulative. She's not always, about love in an altruistic and universal sense. She is very self-interested a lot of the time.
Yeah. And I think that's the case also with Inanna in the earlier lore with the Sumerians. Um, there's often speaking of the evening star aspect, and a lot of the lore is very amorous, which is delightful to read. Um, but but at the end of the day, you're seeing Venus. The sun has gone down, and Venus is still in the sky, and you're moving into nighttime. When you're seeing Venus as a morning star, it's before the day begins. So it's a different mood entirely, and maybe that's where that split came in about what attributes they would bring. Um, the
Mm.
interpretation I've got in the book in terms of some of the lore of Inanna is that when she returns from her journey to the underground, which I believe in world lore, that's the earliest known journey of a deity dying, vanishing for X number of days, and then returning, having that image of rebirth. But when she's reborn, it's in the east, and she's in a pretty bad mood. So, um,
Oh, now that's interesting
yeah, I
because
hadn't thought of it that way before, but you're right. In terms of like what mood would they be in, what mood would she be in? But that's the idea of if Dumuzi, her lover, has not come to her rescue, he's been out busy shining above everybody. Well, often he's being portrayed as the moon, and of course the moon's traveling overhead. Venus heads up underground, comes back in the east, just in time to see him shining overhead. And she looks upon him with the eye of death, and he starts to wane. So um, it sounds like something out of Grand Opera.
it does, but it is, you're so right. That story, you've convinced me. I think this is where it comes from, at least in the West. I don't know about the Mayans, but because you're right, that story, she goes into the underworld and he abandons her there.
Yeah,
She had said, if I go on this journey and I don't come back, you know, after a certain period of time, tell him, and then he can come and rescue me. Well,
yeah,
there's no such thing. He goes, well, she shouldn't have gone under there. She shouldn't have gone there. What am I supposed to do? I can't go there. So and you're right, she goes through this terrible ordeal, is resurrected, no thanks to him, but thanks to a loyal servant.
mm-hmm. Yeah,
And she comes up, and of course she's in wrath, isn't she? Because
yeah,
he's let her down, he's abandoned her, he's left her basically to die and hasn't cared about her. So she's a betrayed woman. And well, betrayed women are generally not feeling very gracious.
no, absolutely not. Um, they seize him by his thighs. They pour the milk out of his 7 churns. The shepherd's crook has disappeared. The churn lies silent. No milk is poured. The cup lies shattered. Dumuzi is no more. Well, there's your waning moon disappearing into the sunlight as Venus keeps rising higher as a morning star. Um, it's I find it absolutely fascinating, where the lore might indeed be that dependent on the actual visual motion of the planets.
Yeah.
Now, what made that more funny for me was then taking them in any kind of order. After Venus comes Mars, and after the beautiful symmetry of Venus's continual orbits marking a star in the night sky over 8 years and all this stuff that's so precise. Mars is just like, yeah, whatever. it it seems that erratic in terms of how things work. And can you predict when Mars is showing up? Nah, it's like a boyfriend that, yeah, if I feel like it, I'll be by. It's a completely different thing. And the lore around Mars and how we interpret Mars tends to match that. So, um, yeah, sorry, this sounds almost simplistic. Like there's got to be more to it. Maybe, maybe not. They keep doing the same thing, these planets. They've been doing it the whole time humans have been watching. Why would we be not paying attention?
Well, I think, this is the thing, is that we are looking at something very ancient, and we are looking at the interpretation of what our ancestors were observing in the sky.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that's very important. And this is why your book is wonderful, and a reminder to everyone that it is called Planets for Pagans, Sacred Sites, Ancient Lore, and Magical Stargazing. And I think that, and yes, here it is. And I think that it's brilliant if you're not used to looking at the night sky, um, especially if you're going off somewhere where it's going to be easy to see things because it's darker. This is a fabulous companion to take with you, because not only will it enrich your understanding of astrology, it will also help you to reconnect with the origins of where it all came from, the night sky. So, Renna, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you, Anna. It was delightful guesting with you.
Thank you. And thank you all for watching. A link to the description box, a link to the book will be in the description box. And Renna, if people want to find you, how do they do that?
Um, I have a website just under my own name, rennashesso.com. That's the easiest place to find me. And there are links that I can be emailed to and communicate through that one.
Fabulous. Thank you. I'll be sure to be putting the links to that in the description box, as well as the links to my own website. And do find me on Substack. The link will be in the description box as well. Next time, we're going to be looking at addiction in the birth chart. Until then, goodbye.